The iPhone 14 is dead. Or rather, Apple is no longer selling the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, at least brand new, with it being fully discontinued in favor of the all-new iPhone 16e, a phone costing the exact same price of $600 and looking a whole lot like the iPhone 14, at least from the front. And this makes sense. The 16e is better than the 14 in nearly every way, hence why we see the 14 now dead altogether, albeit some retailers may keep it in stock for a bit longer. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and clickbait aside, I do believe the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are worth talking about, as they're really some of the oddest iPhones we've ever seen Apple release. They were so similar to the iPhone 13, not only looking identical, but really having no real improvements. It was the first time Apple had brought the plus size option since the 8 Plus, aside from of course the Pro Max phones, and this phone still has that remnant of an era now long gone with the Lightning port. The iPhone 14 and 14 Plus were always very solid smartphones, but they were also some of the most disappointing iPhones I believe Apple has ever released, and so today we're going to take some time to talk about the life, death, and legacy of the iPhone 14. Our story really begins the fall of 2021 with the release of the iPhone 13, 13 mini, 13 Pro, and 13 Pro Max. These phones were all substantial upgrades over their predecessors, with the most immediately visible difference being the now reduced notch and thinner bezels. On the iPhone 13, the cameras were moved to be diagonally oriented instead of vertically, which at least did distinguish it from the 12, even if it was sort of a nothing change. What wasn't nothing was the increased battery life, improved speeds with the A15 Bionic chipset over the A14, and 128 gigs of storage on the base model rather than 64. The iPhone 13 and 13 mini were really the perfect iPhone upgrades, already coming from a rather large change in the iPhone 12. They refined the design, experience, and just made everything better. You could pick one up and definitively see immediately that the 13 was in fact a better smartphone than the 12, and worth at least the extra $100 it cost. For the iPhone 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max, we saw another refinement of design, improved cameras, better battery life, and crucially Pro Motion, giving the display that buttery smooth 120Hz refresh rate. We also now had that A15 Bionic chipset, mind you not the exact same chip as in the iPhone 13, as this version had a single extra GPU core. We also had 6GB of RAM, this being the Pro iPhone, whereas the 13 has only 4. Keep note of those last couple points because they'll be relevant as we move along here, and what I really want to get across is that the biggest new features of the iPhone 13 Pro, those better cameras, the reduced notch, the A15 chip, and the better battery life, all hit the iPhone 13 and 13 mini, which while similar to the 12, still were distinct and unique. Apple had a really good pattern here of giving a lot of their big changes to their entire new line of phones, while saving the best like Pro Motion and the triple cameras for their top tier $1,000 device. By the end of 2021, the iPhone line was the strongest I think we've seen in years. There were many options for those who preferred smaller phones, something completely gone today, and a wide range of devices at a plethora of price points. Even the iPhone 11 was still available at $500, which was quite the bargain for what was at the time only a 2-year-old device. The iPhone SE at $400 was from 2020 and starting to feel its age a bit, especially only being $100 less than the iPhone 11, but in early 2022 we would see the final iPhone before the 14 line's launch, the iPhone SE 3rd generation, which brought the same chipset as the iPhone 13 and the A15, along with 5G networking for a slightly more expensive $430. While this phone wouldn't age great, as Apple would keep selling it at this price for nearly 3 more years, in the moment it was a really enticing budget iPhone for those who still preferred that home button form factor. Things seem to just be going great for Apple right now. And so fast forward to September 2022, and we're getting our yearly iPhone event, and there's some genuine hype, as there nearly always is, as Tim Cook and Apple would unveil to the world the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus alongside the iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max.
As you can see, we're going big with iPhone 14 and even bigger with iPhone 14 Plus.
Let's start briefly with what was new in the 14 Pro, which would replace the 13 Pro outright in Apple's line. We still had all the great features and more or less the same beautiful design, but now this really interesting dynamic island. This was never the biggest selling point ever, but I've always felt that it was an underrated addition to the iOS experience, making things feel more fluid and, well, dynamic. We also finally saw an always-on display, which hey, better late than never. The camera saw some significant upgrades with now a 48 megapixel main wide lens, and I remember this phone, despite looking basically the same as the 13 Pro, that camera was noticeably larger right away as that bump got even somehow more massive. For internal specs, we saw the all-new A16 Bionic chipset, albeit still 6GB of RAM. As a whole, the 14 Pro certainly felt like a smaller upgrade than the 13 Pro was, and the design was still very similar to that of the 12 Pro, but the dynamic island really did lend to things feeling fresh, and this was still ultimately a really terrific smartphone. Not the most exciting Apple's ever launched, but one with some substantial upgrades that made it worthy of being the best iPhone available from 2022 through to 2023. Plus, I mean, just look at that purple color, how could you argue with that? So that's the 14 Pro. Now let's turn to the actual subject of this video in the iPhone 14 and that all-new iPhone 14 Plus.
iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Plus have incredible new features that will help our users in meaningful ways.
We did see a very interesting ad spot that we will not be talking about, but with these phones we learned that Apple were giving up on their mini iPhones altogether, and instead were heading the exact opposite direction, with the 6.1-inch iPhone 14, same size as the normal 13 or just the normal 14 Pro, and then the 6.7-inch iPhone 14 Plus, which was the same size as the Pro Max iPhones. While this wasn't necessarily a bad move on paper, it did raise some questions for me at the time, and indicated the beginning of the end for the small form factor smartphone, which as of today is really gone altogether. It's a pity, because there really weren't any big major flagship smartphones at the level of the 12 mini or 13 mini that managed to be so high-end while retaining such a compact design. Those phones were truly something special, but at the same time, they were never selling too well compared to the larger models. And if you did want a very large iPhone, you'd be spending a whole lot to get it. The 14 Plus in theory made some rational sense, since now instead of paying at least $1,100 for a Pro Max, you could pay $900 for the 14 Plus. Except in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much of a discount, and if you're already willing to pay for more than the base iPhone 14 at $800, you might as well just go to the Pro model anyways, hence why the Plus model iPhones have also never sold that particularly well. Shocking, I know. There's also the question of why Apple couldn't simply continue the mini line and bring all three size options. Imagine a world with an iPhone 14 mini, 14, and 14 Plus, so everybody could be happy. Had this happened, we'd have invariably achieved world peace by this point, but of course, the universe had other plans. And let's be real, those mini iPhones did only appeal to a mini audience to begin with, and at least for another year, you would still be able to purchase the iPhone 13 mini. The 12 mini was discontinued altogether at the time. But now here we are, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. What's new? Well, immediately we can see we've got some new colors. That blue in particular I really liked, and we got a yellow color later on, but other than that, the design is exactly identical to the iPhone 13, and I mean exactly, to the point that if I personally owned a white iPhone 14, I would never be able to tell the two apart. We've got the same diagonally oriented camera lenses, the same lightning port, same aluminum frame and glossy glass back, same thin bezels and smaller notch. In the US, the iPhone 14 was now eSIM only, so no physical SIM tray, so that's something. But okay, sure, design is the same. Big deal. Beauty is only skin deep, right? What matters most is what's on the inside. I would like to preface this entire next section by saying that in spite of my complaints and nitpicking, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are both fantastic phones that have held up really well even approaching 3 years later. I don't think they've ever been a bad buy, per se, even if they're not the greatest buy, and if you have one right now, don't get me wrong, you've got a terrific smartphone that is fully capable of lasting many more years of usage. So please, don't take this too personally, or do. I mean, it's just a smartphone, so you do you. And hey, maybe I'm underselling the iPhone 14. Let's go ahead and go through a thorough, comprehensive list of every notable difference between the iPhone 13 and the 14. Internally, the iPhone 14 is actually easier to repair as the back glass is removable. You also have an ever so slightly larger battery, and I mean ever so slightly, though the performance does amount to an extra hour of video playback according to Apple, so that's something. The Plus, of course, is quite a bit better thanks to the larger size. The main wide camera lens is slightly larger on the iPhone 14, allowing for more light to enter, which should mean slightly better pictures, particularly in lower light situations, though in real life usage, it's going to amount to a pretty minor difference. We do have the new action mode for more stable video, a 4K 30 cinematic mode versus only 1080p 30, and the photonic engine for better computational photography. The front-facing camera also has a slightly larger lens as well, and autofocus rather than fixed focus if you want better and more precise selfies. There's maybe a few more very minor differences in the cameras, but honestly, all of it is pretty negligible to begin with. We've got crash detection, emergency SOS via satellite, and messages via satellite, compared to just the standard emergency SOS feature on previous iPhones. Oh, the iPhone 14 is also 1 gram lighter than the 13 and 0.01 inches thicker. Have no fear, with its slightly thicker frame and very slightly larger camera island, your iPhone 13 case probably won't fit the iPhone 14 perfectly, though it might be pretty close. So I guess the design isn't technically exactly the same, it just looks the same. Can you tell the camera island on the 14 is ever so slightly larger? It's pretty subtle, but it is. Okay, so not a whole lot of change so far, but surely we've got that same A16 Bionic chip from the 14 Pro, right? I mean, we've gotten that every single year going all the way back to, what, 2017 with the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus compared to the iPhone 10? I mean, we gotta get it here, too, right? Well, no, we got instead the A15 Bionic chipset, but have no fear, it's totally different from that of the 13, guys, because, you know, guys, this one has that extra GPU core. That's right, it's the one from the 13 Pro, guys, it's totally different. Okay, joking aside, we also did get 6 gigabytes of RAM rather than the 4 of the iPhone 13, which is at least something of substance. In real life use, you probably really won't notice much difference switching between the two phones, but I would expect apps to stay open in the background longer on the 14, and down the line, I mean overall there should be better performance. Maybe it'll get an extra year of updates, who knows. Still, all in all, this was a pretty paltry showing for an iPhone that was a whole extra number newer than the previous model. There's a certain expectation that comes with every iPhone launch, and one that's always been true. Sure, not every iPhone is dramatically different. They might look the exact same, even going all the way back to 2009 with that first S model iPhone. There may not be very many features that make for any meaningful change. The cameras some years are barely touched, but there's always something we could rely upon no matter what, a new chipset with better performance. This doesn't always lead to better longevity. The iPhone 6 from 2014, for example, with the A8, got to iOS 12, the exact same update as the 2013 iPhone 5S with the A7 chip. But even so, there's a new generation chip there. The expectation and guarantee is that when you're buying a new iPhone, it's going to be substantially better than the previous generation in some areas, even if it's not very many. And the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, in my opinion, are the first iPhones to truly break this pattern. Well, with the exception of the iPhone 5C anyways, which, yeah, I mean, okay, the 5C was kind of its own thing, so I don't know if you can really count it. It wasn't technically an upgrade to any iPhone per se. It sort of just existed. And you know what, the 5C gets enough crap, so we're gonna give it a break this video. 2 extra gigs of RAM on top of a handful of nearly negligible changes is ludicrous when you consider that Apple was selling this phone for $100 more than the iPhone 13. Why would you ever buy the iPhone 14 when you could save some cash and just get the 13 instead? Basically the same phone. They had the same amount of storage, practically the same camera quality, the exact same design, basically the same specs. Why wouldn't you keep your Ben Franklin? I mean, look at him. He seems like a smart guy. Do you think he would bother spending the extra money on the iPhone 14? There are many ways in which Apple could have made this a far better deal for their customers, and we'll discuss a couple of them shortly. But here's the biggest issue: no one really cares. And I don't mean just about how we're talking about the technical specifications of smartphones and things that only nerds maybe care about. I mean that the audience buying the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, the people buying new iPhones year to year, they don't care because they don't really know any better. Because there's this expectation and guarantee of every new iPhone being a genuine improvement from the previous. It's a reputation Apple has earned over the years by putting the work in. They've gained the trust of the consumer, and rightfully so. Now, is the iPhone 14 a betrayal of this trust? Had Apple simply been leading us on for the past decade and a half, only to pull out the rug from beneath us? Should we ever have trusted them? Well, to unironically assert this would be awfully dramatic and a complete overreaction, but screw it, I'm kind of saying it. Apple wronged us here. That's right, this is the most disappointing iPhone upgrade of all time, full stop. Was it always their plan to have somewhat inconsistent but still reliably decent upgrades every year until they could get away with doing otherwise? Obviously not, but I do think the 14 shows that Apple knows their customer base well and is aware they can get away with penny pinching in order to create a larger gap between their Pro and non-Pro models. I think the iPhone 13 was just a little too good and they needed to knock it down a peg. They know it's safe to presume that customers will see the iPhone 14 beside the iPhone 13 and not think twice about whether or not the 14 is really any better, because of course it has to be better. It's a bigger number. And okay, I've complained plenty here, and I do want to talk about the legacy of the iPhone 14 and how it'll hold up in the future, but first, how could Apple have fixed this situation? I mean, easy answer, make the iPhone 14 an actual upgrade, problem solved. But what would that even entail? I'd say the A16 chip would be a good start. If not that, then at least bring the 48 megapixel wide lens from the 14 Pro or something. Maybe bring USB-C a year early, that would have been nice. If we also want to be penny pinchers, the iPhone 13 could have started at 64 gigs rather than 128, and the 14 could have had 128 like it did in reality. This would have made the phone at only $100 more actually a reasonable deal, albeit the 13's overall value would have been hurt significantly in the process. Maybe the iPhone 14 should have had the dynamic island, but I don't really blame Apple for waiting until the iPhone 15 to bring that. It wasn't a necessary feature, and really all we needed was at least one big feature on the 14 to tide us over to the next year. Comparatively speaking, the 15 was a decent jump from the 14. It has the A16 chipset from the 14 Pro, the dynamic island, USB-C, the 48 megapixel main wide lens. Heck, it's still being sold for $700 right now, though there's very little reason to purchase it over the 16e in my opinion. Whichever way you toss it, the iPhone 14 was a tiny upgrade that wouldn't even be worthy of being called the iPhone 13s or something. It's frankly a bit pathetic. Apple's just lucky that the phone itself is still pretty awesome, because the iPhone 13 was awesome, and this is basically the same device.
iPhone 14 and iPhone 14 Plus, with a larger 6.7-inch display, are full of innovations, including a fantastic new camera system and a new front camera with autofocus.
The iPhone 14 and 14 Plus have gone out not with a bang, but a whimper. Due to the EU requiring all smartphones have USB-C these days, the 14 had already been quietly discontinued in a good few countries, and so it kind of only makes sense Apple wouldn't bother to keep selling it everywhere else. It's also just a logical move with the iPhone 16e coming out. Though with the iPhone SE being retired now as well, I do kind of wonder if Apple could have kept the iPhone 14 around just at a reduced price. Not in the EU obviously, but in other places. Even something like $500 would have been maybe not a great deal considering the 16e brings quite a few new features and much better specs, but it would at least help fill that big hole in Apple's lineup where the SE used to be. There is no budget iPhone, and that's pretty ridiculous. Regardless, that SE is gone now, as is the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. These phones will continue to remain available with some carriers and retailers as inventory dwindles, but over the coming months they'll slowly become harder and harder to find, until eventually you'll have no choice but to turn to the used market if you want one. And hey, that's not the worst idea, because for as much crap as I've given these phones for being such minor refreshes over the iPhone 13, they are still fantastic devices. There's a lot to like about the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, from the premium feeling aluminum and glass design to the still beautiful OLED screen, the pretty great cameras, the very much decent specs and hardware in 2025. I mean, what's not to like? These phones perform well on iOS 18 and will continue to do the same on iOS 19, and they're set to receive a good few more years of major software support to boot. So while I might call these phones dead, they're only of course really dead in the sense that Apple is no longer selling them brand new. It'll be a number of years before they're actually no longer supported by new updates. It is actually quite difficult to estimate just how many updates the 14 will get, given how it uses the same chip from the iPhone 13 Pro from 2021, but this phone is from 2022. Typically Apple's phones tend to get around 6 to 7 years of big updates as of recent, so while the 14 could theoretically get to 2029, and I think that would be a reasonable thing to expect, there is a good chance it'll end its life around late 2028 or so. I would say it probably gets an extra year over the iPhone 13. It does have that extra 2 gigs of RAM, but who really knows? Surely not over the 13 Pro? I don't know. Even then, of course, though, there's still security updates for who knows how long. One of the best things about iPhones is their longevity, both in retaining value on the used market, but also just how long they are realistically very usable for. For most users, the battery will crap out long before you lose software support or the phone gets too slow, although a bad battery can definitely lead to slowdown, and eventually getting it replaced isn't a bad idea if you need to. While the value's at times questionable, this has been a really strong iPhone purchase for many users in the past few years. It's the phone my dad owns, my grandparents own, and there's millions of users still getting by just fine on these devices.
These incredible products each offer so many great capabilities and work seamlessly together in a way that only Apple can deliver.
It's kind of laughable how Apple opened by saying that they were going big with the iPhone 14 and even bigger with the 14 Plus, considering these probably are the smallest iPhone upgrades ever, and Apple does deserve a lot of criticism for how they handled this, if only for removing the Mini from their lineup, something I know a lot of users have been frustrated by, but ultimately, the hardware here is still great. The iPhone 14 is only marginally better than the 13, and even calling it that is generous, but again, that iPhone 13 is pretty great too. As much as Apple can be justifiably called greedy and have monopolized about half of the smartphone market, at least in the US, they do still make consistently reliable devices, even if we're not always getting much in the way of upgrades year to year anymore. The iPhone 16, as unexciting as that phone has been, at least brought specs comparable to the 16 Pro rather than an older generation chip. It was a step in the right direction, even if it was just course correcting for a couple rough years.
Making products that are so personal and indispensable is what drives us to continue innovating. improving on what are already best-in-class experiences.
I'm not sure the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus have any real legacy to speak of. They were pricey, they were the last iPhones with a lightning port, they killed the mini iPhone, and they brought back the Plus models that I don't think anyone was really asking for, not when the Pro Max iPhones were always available to begin with. They certainly didn't live up to being a full number higher than the 13, but in the very least for those who are using these phones right now, you've got a pretty good iPhone all things considered, and one set up to stay that way for the foreseeable future. This might be one of the worst iPhones of all time, and that's a video I've done by the way, but the 14 and 14 Plus are still iPhones, and there is a level of quality there that Apple managed to achieve, as they always do. In short, if I had to describe the iPhone 14's legacy, I'd say, could be worse, and really should have been way better, but definitely could have been worse. And so with that, I think I'm right about done here. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. Make sure you comment down below again all of your thoughts. What do you think of the iPhone 14? Have I been too hard on it, or was it as disappointing an upgrade over the 13 as I've made it out to be? Very curious to hear from all of you. We do have a Discord server, maybe come by, say hi, some great people over there, and a huge shout out to the channel members for being amazing people. Thank you so much for your support. And thank you all for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.